Okay, so our next speaker is Rosa. Rosa is a husband, father, and social studies teacher from Virginia and founder of the company Students of History. So please give a warm welcome to Luke.
Thank you. Welcome, my fellow immigrants. I say that because there's a story, possibly apocryphal, from FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, addressed the very hoity-toity daughters of the American Revolution that way. You know, this is a group that refused Marian Anderson's performance. But he definitely said to them, remember always, you and I, especially, are descended from immigrants and revolutionists. Thank you. So yes, my name is Luke Rosa. I am a descendant of immigrants as well. My immigrant story is my family's original last name was Van Rusa, but supposedly a clerk at Ellis Island thought that sounded too ethnic, so they shortened it to the more Spanish sounding Rosa. So that's how I am now to my Latinx students, Mr. Pink. But I thought I would talk with you today about Mexican repatriation. This is something I never learned about in school. How many, just show of hands, how many people know about repatriation during the Great Depression? All right, I'm glad, okay, good. Well, we're going to learn today. So, for background, around the turn of the century, between 1880 and 1930, 27 million immigrants came to America. And for reference, in 1880, America's population was only 50 million, so that's a 50% increase. America provided refuge at this time for Jews fleeing the pogroms in Eastern Russia, or Russia and Eastern Europe. For the Armenians fleeing the genocide, America provided refuge. And for Mexicans fleeing the revolution, America provided a place of safety and a life without fear. And many of the Mexican immigrants at this time documented their experiences in songs known as corridos. And a popular refrain in these corridos ballads was "Corre, corre, maquinita," which it's fun to sing if you guys want to sing it with me here. Corre, corre, maquinita. We're going to come back to that, spoiler alert. However, after World War I, American attitudes towards immigration shifted. Nationalism was on the rise. Immigrants' loyalties were called into question. There was the Soviet Ark. There was Sacco and Vanzetti. There were quota laws that limited immigration. Then, of course, came the Great Depression. Banks closed. Unemployment soared to 25%. And Americans started to believe that charity and jobs should be held for native-born Americans. And this was the very idea promoted by our President Herbert Hoover's Secretary of Labor, William Doak. Doak believed that by removing Mexican Americans, that would reduce relief expenditures and save jobs for, as he called, Native Americans. And he set about ensuring that policy would take place. The symbolic start of repatriation began with a raid on a park a lot like this one called La Placita Park in Los Angeles. Officers surrounded the park, rounded up anyone with brown skin, it ended up being about 400 people, and demanded proof of citizenship. Anyone that could not provide that documentation was placed on a truck, taken to the train station, and sent on that maquinita south deep into Mexico. Corre, corre, maquinita. Run, run, machine. Soon mass deportations began to take place across the country as counties and cities took it on their own to heed Doak's call. Often it was social workers and local law enforcement who targeted people for removal. However, question, I bet all of you guys know this, whose responsibility is it for immigration and deportation? The federal government, yes, I heard that somewhere. The federal government's responsibility. So these localities weren't allowed to do that. So what they called it, they can't call it deportation, they called it repatriation, returning people to their homeland. Official letters would go out, or hand-delivered, stating, you and your family would be better off in Mexico. Report to the train station on such and such a date, here are your tickets, you may take 4 suitcases with you. If you do not show up, you will be deported and have no chance of ever returning to the United States. Communities across the United States coerced thousands of Mexican Americans to leave in this way. Some local governments actually went through their employee rolls and identified anyone with a Mexican-sounding name and identified them for repatriation. So I'm imagining my ancestors back then being like, okay, yes, the name is Rosa, but I swear it was Van Rusa. There was this clerk at Ellis Island. But of course, many of Mexican descent here, they didn't cross a border to get here. It was the border that crossed them. This is only about 3 or 4 generations after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So where we are right now is part of Mexico, parts of 7 U.S. states. Their descendants went back that far, and historians, Francisco Valderrama is the expert on this, have found that over 60% of the deportations and repatriations of this period were American citizens. For example, one famous one, his name was Ignacio Pina, and he was 6 years old at this time, living with his family in rural Idaho in 1931. As they sat down for breakfast, officers came to their home, arrested them, took the whole family into custody, and brought them to jail. He, his mother, his 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and his father. They were placed in jail, 2 separate jail cells, for about a week before they were placed on a train and shipped south to Mexico. Corre Maquinita. The family was never able to return their personal belongings, including Ignacio and his siblings' U.S. birth certificates and documentation from his father of having worked here for 25 years. Even in the industrial north, this was happening. In cities like Detroit, U.S. Steel and Ford Motor Company saw this as an opportunity to lay off their Mexican-American workers because profits are down. It's the Depression. The famed Mexican painter Diego Rivera was actually in Detroit at this time working on his frescoes, and he was convinced to support repatriation. But what he did was he paid the train tickets for all those people who were laid off. And his famous wife, you know Diego Rivera's famous wife, Frida Kahlo, yes. Frida Kahlo, and I actually love this. She supported repatriation, but it's because she thought Americans were boring. With faces like unbaked rolls, she said. She's like, corre maquinita, gringos aburridos. And so historians have found, conservative estimates, about 1 million Mexican Americans were repatriated or deported during this period of 1929 to 1936. Some have even compared it to an ethnic cleansing. Entire neighborhoods and communities were destroyed. Because often it didn't return these Mexican Americans to their home country, it sent them to exile in a foreign land. They didn't know why they were being asked to leave, just that their society didn't want them. And for children especially, this trip was harrowing. They're leaving the only country they've ever known for a long train ride to a foreign land, to a country they don't know where no one speaks English. Corre maquinita. However, for some, the joy of seeing family again allowed them to forget or hide the shame of deportation. And this experience was part of many of those corridos ballads. One of them, called Despedida de Carnecity, goes, Inolvidable mañana que regresamos gustosos a la patria mexicana. An unforgettable morning, we returned happily to the Mexican homeland. And in the song, these repatriates returned to Mexico with strength and dignity. They chose to keep their families together and rebuild their lives in the midst of the worst economic crisis in world history. They possess the strength and a resolve that I think any of us here would envy. And there's even really greater hope for the future. Recently in California, 5th graders successfully led a campaign to have repatriation placed as part of the social studies curriculum in the state. They testified, 5th graders, before the state board and compared repatriation to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Indian Removal Act, and Japanese internment. And you know, seeing this crowd here today, all of you, and the young people who are organizing events like March for Our Lives, the Black Lives Matter movement, protests across the country, and like marginalized groups who are, finally getting their voice heard in this country, I'm starting to realize that I think together we have the strength to take that train of American history, that maquinita, and drive it in the right direction, with compassion for all, by protecting human rights, with keeping our families together, with empathy for all of our neighbors, so that we can all join together and sing proudly in regards to that great locomotive of American history, Corre, corre, maquinita.